Welcome back to Talking Dragon Age, the show where I talk about Dragon Age. Today, we talk about romances. Specifically, we'll talk about what makes a good romance while talking about some of the most significant ones, and then move on to what I think they should do in the future. A couple of things to get out of the way first. You should know that I'm really a sucker for love stories, so my personal tastes are going to lean a bit more towards that. Also, feel free to disagree with me. Differing opinions are part of what makes this topic so much fun. Okay, so what makes good romance? Here's a checklist of everything I'm looking for. One of the most important things in any romance is persistence. Every time I return to a person, I want to feel like there's actually something there with us. Let's take a look at Cassandra. She was the first person I romanced in Inquisition, and while there were a few romantic scenes with her, it didn't really feel like either of us were actually committed to a relationship. I get that that's partly her character being not really used to it, but nevertheless, the game doesn't often remind us that we are in a loving relationship. Let's compare this to Cullen's. Every time I returned to Skyhold, I felt like there was something there. The relationship persisted. Moreover, the relationship developed. There were many scenes that made it feel real, like a real love story was happening in the midst of the war. I really felt like the characters were growing with each other. More than that, it felt like there was more going on behind the scenes. Like there were a few minor liaisons beyond what we actually see and experience. A few others pull this off too. The Iron Bull, Dorian, Sera, Fenris, Isabella, Alistair, Leliana. It feels like there's more. Which brings me to the next topic, which is emotion. A romance needs to provoke legitimate emotion from me. Now, most characters do this on their own. That's something that Bioware excels at. But it's different in a proper romance. I'll try to give you an example. Let's look at Fenris. I thought he was mostly a dick at first, but after a few playthroughs I really came to understand him and respect him. Some of those intense scenes with him, like with his sister, I really felt for him. But in a romance with him, you legitimately worry for him. I think it's the difference between a good friend where you have their back and a love that you savor and protect. I think it's the same degree of care, and in either scenario you stand by them through the worst of it. But again, it provokes emotion, real care, compassion, often joy. That is an extremely important part of a romance. And I kind of touched on it earlier, but the last two things I want to talk about are significant development and payoff. Seeing the progression from attraction to love is a major part of a strong romance. I'm not saying it's always necessary, but since most of the characters are still strangers at the beginning, it's certainly an important thing to have. And the more this impacts a character's character, the better. Let's look at Solas for this one. There are really three main ways our relationship with him can go. He will always hold respect for you, but depending on your choices, he may think of you as a rival, a friend, or a lover. These subtle animation and dialogue changes here in the final scene of Trespasser really go a long way, or at least they do for me, and I'm certain this will continue to expand in the next game. Another one that comes to mind here is Isabella. If you romanced her, and you look at how she was in Act 1 and then in Act 3, you can really see a major growth in her character and your relationship, and I think it pays off really well. Now, if you didn't romance her, there is still a bit of that depending on her approval rating, but I think she might be the best example of how a romance should be in comparison to a non-romanced companion. And that's ironic for me because I personally didn't really like her that way, but I can still clearly see the quality of that story as a whole. I really hope I'm explaining this well. Anyway, now that we have talked about what makes a good romance, let's move on to what I want to see in the future. I think I mentioned most of these in my Future Companions video, but now I can go into more detail about what I want in a romance. So let's start off here with Scout Lace Harding. I could rant for a long time about my frustrations of her not being a legitimate romance option in Inquisition, but I'm trying to keep this as condensed as possible, so I'm going to restrain myself. So, from what we saw of her character and background in the main game and in Jaws of Hakon, she is a perfect candidate for a love interest. She's got everything. She's a badass archer, she's a dwarf with freckles, she's kind, sweet, vicious, and just an all-around terrific character who already has a lot of love from the fans. Next up, we have a male dwarf. I'm putting this on the list because we have been sorely lacking in dwarf companions, and we have yet to see a dwarf romance even to this day. Now, this is not necessarily needed in the next game, it could wait until the one after, and despite the fact that I probably wouldn't pursue it myself, I will be upset if we never see a male dwarf romance. So, moving on, let's talk about a female Qunari. Let's say she's a Talvashoth. I've been yearning for a proper Talvashoth companion since DA2. I mean, someone who left the Qun before joining our hero, and then learning about their past a little at a time. I always envisioned this character as a male, like Maraz here, but the more I think about it, the more I like the idea of having a romanceable female Talvashoth. Then they could even get more into how the Qunari view gender. They had a fair bit of that in Inquisition, but hearing it firsthand from a female fighter and how she would have dealt with that fact would be very interesting. So, on the subject of Qunari, let's talk about Talis. Talis is a complex character, and that's a big reason why I think she would be a fantastic companion, and both a fascinating and enticing love interest. Hearing what she's been up to the past few years, the effect Hawke had on her, how she's been dealing with the Qun, this is all incredible material that is begging to be explored further. Now, I realize she may have had a brief dalliance with Hawke, and I think that would affect her personal story, but I don't think it was a big enough deal as to lock her off from any future relationship. So next up, we have a Dalish elf. We've only had one Dalish romance option, and she was kind of an outcast. So I'm looking for someone more like Arianne, the Dalish warrior from Witch Hunt. I really liked her, and she's pretty much what I'm looking for in a Dalish companion. She's brave, devoted, and kind once you show you're not a threat. Also, I'm extremely interested to see how the Dalish react to the whole thing going down with Solas. I imagine there would be division among them. Some may want to join Solas, some may despise him on principle, others may not be sure how to feel about it. That being said, I should also mention that while I adore Arianne and I absolutely want her as a companion and potential love interest, I would also like a male Dalish warrior, but mostly because we just haven't had one yet. Alright, now one of my absolute favorites for this list, a feminine spirit of hope. I say feminine because spirits don't technically have genders, but they do often exhibit qualities that represent one, like Cole and Justice were, for all intents and purposes, male. Speaking of Cole, he's a good comparison here. I honestly think he is my favorite companion in Inquisition, and not just because we share a name. Seeing his journey was just amazing to me. An avatar of compassion whose entire existence is dedicated to helping people is something so beautiful and inspiring I can barely describe it. Now, Cole's story was centered around becoming a real boy, and so we don't want a redo of that. This spirit should have her own unique story, and I think her romance should be more centered on experiencing love for the first time, while her standard companion story would be centered on just feeling new things. And I've said before, a romance with any kind of spirit would be fascinating. Just seeing that development into love with a spirit who would have previously only seen humanity from beyond the veil, it all sounds so interesting to me. And I guess this could theoretically be done with any spirit, but the reason I say hope over any other is because hope is a beautiful and immensely powerful force, and I adore the idea of a being whose entire existence is devoted to it. But moving on from her, it's time to get to the romance I want more than any other. Bethany Hawke. And yeah, him too, whatever. But Bethany, for me, she is just the ideal candidate for a romance. She is so strong and has such a good heart in spite of everything she has endured. She is pretty and adorable, kind and sincere, and except for the magic, she's normal. What I mean by that is she isn't a master spy, a political figure, or anything like that. She's just a person. That's part of why she's so amazing. The fact that she is special all on her own. She doesn't need that fantastical origin to make her great. She just is. And Carver, yeah. So I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about the fact that they could have died, and all I have to say to that is, we could have chopped off Leliana's head and she came back. So I don't care if the game said she died or not. I want her as a romance and I will settle for no less. Well, maybe in the books or comics if she finds love. That might be okay. I should also mention that I did see one comment on my Future Companions video saying that it would be a lot of work to write and voice two mutually exclusive companions with their own stories and personality for what will probably be a pretty lengthy game. And while I definitely understand that, they did it for DA2. Granted, they weren't present for most of Acts 2 and 3, but Act 1 was longer than the others anyway, and they were still pretty fleshed out as a whole. So, yeah. Bethany. Okay, this video is getting long, so I better wrap this up. So if you guys have any ideas for your own romance options or just want to comment about mine, I would love to read what you guys think. So that's it for now, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, Tala Nadas.